The drive through Houston had been quiet, a tense calm settling over me as I approached Daniel's family home. The mansion loomed with polished marble steps reflecting the late afternoon sun, contemporary art pieces peeking through floor-to-ceiling windows. My heels clicked on the stone floor of the grand foyer as I stepped inside, my eyes instinctively scanning for any familiar cues, any hint of the warmth I had hoped for. Instead, there was an almost imperceptible stiffness in the air. Daniel smiled, clearly oblivious to the subtle undertones, while his sister, Victoria, greeted me with a measured politeness, her smile polite but lacking genuine warmth. I noticed the way she adjusted her pearl necklace, the faint tilt of her head, details that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. My silk scarf, carelessly draped over the entry table, caught my eye for a moment, a small, almost meaningless object that somehow anchored me to the reality of this home. Victoria's voice was soft, almost rehearsed. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, extending her hand with a precision that hinted at control more than friendliness. I shook it, noting the slight condescension beneath the surface. Daniel chattered about wedding plans, oblivious to the tension that hung like static in the air. I nodded politely, keeping my composure, aware that any overt reaction would be noted and possibly misinterpreted. Then, casually, Victoria mentioned she needed to clarify some details about the prenup. My stomach tightened. A prenup? 2 days before our wedding? My curiosity spiked, mingling with irritation that I carefully tucked away behind a calm exterior. I told myself not to overreact, but inwardly, I was already calculating, evaluating her motives, and cataloging the possible leverage points. When she handed me the document, I felt a momentary shock, a flush of disbelief warming my cheeks. The envelope was heavy, crisp, intimidating. My fingers lingered on the edge, steadying myself before opening it. The terms were meticulous, some bordering on absurd, clauses that seemed to assume I had nothing of value to contribute. I felt a sting, not just at the implications for my relationship, but at the subtle underestimation of my achievements. $10 million in assets, painstakingly accrued, completely disregarded in their assumptions. Victoria's eyes darted toward me, searching for a reaction, but I kept my face neutral, betraying nothing. Inside, a plan began to form, strategic and deliberate, as I noted each point, each potential weakness, each avenue for counteraction. Sitting in the library corner, I let the initial anger settle into a simmering awareness. Memories of being underestimated, dismissed, or outright ignored surfaced, years of quietly building my independence, proving my resilience. I recalled advice from mentors, quotes that had guided me through past challenges. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's measured, patient, deliberate. My resolve hardened. I would not be caught off guard, nor would I allow a last-minute document to dictate the terms of my life. Each clause, each wording choice, became fodder for careful observation, mental notes filed away for later. The silk scarf on the foyer table returned to my thoughts, not important in itself, but emblematic of the small details I would use to understand and predict their moves. Politeness masked the tension as I placed the prenup aside, a calculated act of courtesy that concealed the strategic mind at work. The room seemed to constrict slightly with the unspoken challenge, a silent duel of perception and power. I made note of every glance, every word, cataloging them as one might record pieces in a chess game. Then, my phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. Its brevity masked a heavier implication. Victoria had intentions beyond mere legal formalities. I felt a shiver of anticipation, knowing that the days to come would require every ounce of focus, every measure of intelligence I had honed over years. I'll play my cards carefully, but I will not be dismissed, I thought, tucking the phone back into my purse, eyes scanning the room once more, ready for what was to come. Morning light filtered through the curtains of the guest suite, painting the walls in soft gold. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, turning over the events of the previous day. The prenup document sat heavy in my mind, a reminder that Victoria's smile and measured politeness masked a sharper edge than I had anticipated. I glanced around the room, taking in the family portraits, the grand molding, the subtle placement of awards and certificates, each detail signaling hierarchy and influence. My eyes fell on the silk scarf I had noticed yesterday in the foyer, now folded neatly on the nightstand, a small, almost absurd object that had already become a touchstone for my awareness of their undercurrents. Daniel slept beside me, unaware of the tension rippling beneath the surface, blissfully ignorant of the subtle power plays threading through his family. I made a mental note: patience first, observation always. Today, I would gather information, catalog gestures, and assess my options before taking any steps. My strategy would not be rash. I had learned the value of careful calculation. Breakfast was quiet, a polite dance of small talk and fleeting smiles. Daniel chatted about seating arrangements and floral designs, but I noticed the tiny hesitations in his sister's words, the way she lingered slightly too long on certain topics. Then Daniel mentioned, almost innocently, that Victoria had asked him about certain financial details, phrasing it as a casual inquiry. My stomach tightened. The comment, meant to sound harmless, revealed a probing intent I couldn't ignore. I smiled lightly, nodding, but inwardly, I catalogued the implications. My mind raced through potential motives and outcomes, balancing confrontation against strategic patience. I made mental notes of who in the household might side with me and who would be complicit if the situation escalated. Outwardly, I remained calm, sipping my coffee, listening, observing, letting the subtle power shifts reveal themselves. By mid-morning, I found a quiet spot near the library to watch Victoria interact with the staff and family. Every gesture, every inflection of her voice, told a story. She moved with precision, seating guests deliberately, offering small favors that seemed innocent but hinted at expectations and obligations. One brief interaction caught my attention. A housekeeper adjusted a decorative pillow at Victoria's subtle nod, a minor act, yet it spoke volumes about her influence and her control over the household's daily rhythm. My mind catalogued each movement, each smile, each eye roll carefully concealed from the untrained observer. The patterns were clear. Victoria expected compliance and exerted pressure with finesse. I began outlining a quiet strategy, noting where I might leverage legal, social, or emotional tools to counter her maneuvers without revealing my awareness prematurely. Every action, every observation fed into a growing map of power dynamics and potential leverage. As the evening settled, I retreated to my room, laying out notes, wedding documents, and mental observations across the desk. I reviewed family connections, assessed vulnerabilities, and reflected on my own past experiences of being underestimated. The anger I felt from yesterday had cooled into measured resolve, a clarity that sharpened my mind rather than clouded it. The silk scarf on the chair caught my eye once more, a trivial detail transformed into a symbol of perceptiveness. I mapped out the possibilities for tomorrow: subtle challenges, controlled responses, and strategic positioning. Each scenario was weighed with care, emotions balanced with intellect, ensuring that when the moment came, I would act not impulsively but decisively. I was prepared to test boundaries and assert influence quietly, without raising alarms. Night fell, and I stood by the window, watching the soft glow of lights across the estate. Victoria moved through the rooms with that same measured authority, unaware that I had been tracking each step. My pulse quickened when a small envelope appeared under my door, anonymous and unmarked. Inside, a note hinted at deeper plans, suggesting Victoria's involvement extended further than even Daniel realized. Anxiety prickled at my skin, yet alongside it, a crystalline focus sharpened my resolve. I knew I would not be intimidated or misled. This was only the beginning. I tucked the note into my planner and exhaled slowly, bracing myself for the subtle confrontations of the coming days, ready to turn observation into action, patience into power, and awareness into strategic advantage. I woke early, the Houston sun still soft against the curtains, my mind heavy with the anonymous note from last night. Every word seemed loaded with intention, every implication a thread weaving through Victoria's careful control of our surroundings. I pulled the prenup back from the drawer, skimming the clauses I had already studied, this time with sharper scrutiny. Each sentence, each paragraph, suggested leverage points if handled carefully. My eyes traced the family photos lining the hallway, smiles frozen in frames masking complex hierarchies I had only begun to understand. Daniel moved around the suite, completely unaware, humming softly as he showered, oblivious to the undercurrents pulsing beneath the surface. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, then started mentally plotting, observe, catalog, and wait for the moment when subtle influence could turn into strategic advantage. Today would require focus and poise, calculated engagement rather than immediate confrontation. By late morning, I joined the small family brunch, the dining room alive with polite conversation and the scent of fresh pastries. Victoria's presence was magnetic, her smiles effortless, yet beneath them I sensed the precise placement of every word. She casually remarked on seating arrangements and gently teased Daniel about minor wedding details, but one phrase landed with the weight of a hidden threat. It was innocent, she intended, yet it carried a sharp double meaning, implying expectations and obligations subtly aimed at me. I noted the reactions around the table, the quick glance from an aunt, a flicker of hesitation in a cousin, and I mentally mapped the alliances and potential weak points in her influence. Calm on the outside, my mind raced with counter-strategies, weighing options carefully. I would not give away awareness, but I would be ready to act if her maneuvers overstepped. The afternoon stretched on, and I remained alert, shadowing Victoria's movements as she guided conversations, distributed smiles, and ensured attention flowed her way. Daniel chatted obliviously nearby, his laughter untainted by the tension threading through the room. Then I overheard her speaking quietly to another family member, words meant for no ears but mine. "We need to correct the injustices before this wedding. Make sure things go smoothly." My heart skipped. The meaning was clear. She intended to assert control, to adjust perceptions and influence outcomes, likely without Daniel even realizing it. Frustration stirred within me, but I tamped it down, letting strategic patience win over impulsive reaction. My mind plotted subtle actions that could reveal her manipulations at the right moment, noting potential seating arrangements, gestures, and cues to exploit the imbalance of power. The tension was rising, yet I felt a steady thread of empowerment under the surface. Knowledge and observation were my allies. By evening, I retreated to my quarters, spreading out notes, scribbles, and observations gathered over the day. Each interaction, each half-smile, each shift in posture told a story. I reviewed possible leverage points, noting subtle vulnerabilities in Victoria's plan. My thoughts drifted to past experiences where being underestimated had been my greatest advantage. Today, that principle would guide me. The silk scarf from the foyer, folded neatly in the corner, became a quiet reminder of how unnoticed details often carried weight far beyond their size. I considered multiple outcomes, prepared contingencies, and let frustration fuel calculation rather than anger. Tomorrow's family gathering would not be a casual dinner. It would be a stage where every glance, word, and gesture mattered. I would move deliberately, maintaining composure while quietly asserting my presence. Night descended, and I lingered by the window, catching glimpses of Victoria moving through the rooms, her authority subtle but omnipresent. I traced the lines of conversation, the way she directed attention, and the micro-gestures that commanded compliance. Then a small flash of insight, a hint left unintentionally, revealed the possibility of a public display, a maneuver aimed at establishing dominance in front of key family members at the rehearsal dinner. My pulse quickened, but alongside the apprehension was clarity. I knew the battlefield, and I had prepared. Observation, patience, and strategic planning would define my next moves. Every detail, every nuance would matter, and tomorrow I would not be unprepared. The evening air was heavy as I stepped into the dining hall, the soft hum of polite chatter mingling with the subtle clink of glassware. The room glowed with candlelight, casting long shadows over the carefully arranged tables, each place setting a testament to meticulous planning. I could feel the tension pulsing beneath the surface, the quiet, almost imperceptible undercurrents that dictated interactions here. Daniel seemed tense, adjusting his tie for the third time, oblivious to the web of subtle power plays already in motion. My gaze swept over the room, cataloging every detail, the positioning of chairs, the angles of family portraits, the way Victoria's smirk lingered just long enough to hint at unseen agendas. I reminded myself to stay poised, to gather information, and to resist the urge to react impulsively. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word would have to be measured carefully tonight. As dinner commenced, Victoria deftly redirected praise meant for me, turning attention toward her own carefully curated narrative. A toast acknowledging the wedding arrangements seemed to glide off my contributions, landing squarely on her shoulders. My jaw tightened, but I forced a soft smile, noting guests' subtle reactions, the quick nods of acknowledgement, the tiny flickers of surprise. I mentally flagged allies, cataloged microaggressions, and mapped the terrain of influence she had already begun to manipulate. Each backhanded compliment and dismissive gesture became a point of information, a clue for a countermove. My mind churned with silent strategies, weighing the optics of subtle pushback versus maintaining the carefully crafted facade of composure. This was not simply a dinner, it was a performance of control, and I needed to ensure my role was not diminished. Midway through the evening, a small but pointed incident unfolded. Victoria mispronounced my name during an acknowledgement, her voice laced with mock concern, drawing attention to the misstep in front of a few key family members. The ripple of awkwardness was brief, yet enough to remind everyone of her control, or so she thought. I held my expression neutral, sipping my water slowly, while inwardly noting the sting. Memories of past moments when my achievements were minimized surfaced, fueling a controlled fire of determination. I calculated the timing, anticipating the consequences of any response. Confrontation now would reveal awareness. Patience, however, could transform this public slight into a future advantage. Every smile, every nod, every gesture of acknowledgement would need to be carefully choreographed. Later, I excused myself for a brief retreat, stepping into a quieter hallway to gather my thoughts. Folding the napkin in my hands, I reflected on the dynamics I had observed, linking them to past experiences of underestimation and resilience. I traced the patterns of Victoria's behavior, identifying moments of vulnerability and potential leverage. The seating chart, once merely decorative, now served as a reminder of spatial influence and control. I assessed Daniel's reactions, his oblivion to the subtle manipulations highlighting both risk and opportunity. Drawing strength from the small victories of observation and planning, I resolved to orchestrate a subtle countermove, ensuring that the narrative of the evening and the days to follow would not be dictated solely by Victoria's machinations. As the evening wound down, I lingered near the periphery of the room, catching fragments of whispered conversation. One snippet, barely audible, hinted at a larger maneuver she intended for tomorrow, something designed to display dominance publicly, perhaps even at the wedding itself. My chest tightened, a mixture of anxiety and resolve coursing through me. I folded the note mentally into my arsenal, understanding that knowledge was the true currency of power here. With measured breath, I reminded myself, tomorrow every glance, every word, every toast would be a calculated move on this intricate chessboard. And I was ready. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the family home, highlighting the polished wood floors and ornate moldings. I moved through the suite, checklist in hand, reviewing every detail I could recall from the rehearsal dinner. My mind traced the subtle manipulations Victoria had executed, from her redirected praises to the tiny mispronunciations designed to unsettle me. Daniel fussed with cufflinks, his nervous energy obvious, but his attempt to reassure me did little to ease the tension I felt. I reminded myself to stay composed, to anticipate every possible point of conflict, and to respond strategically rather than impulsively. Even minor irritations among the family, the misplaced napkin, a hesitant glance from a distant cousin, were noted and mentally filed for potential leverage later. The seating charts and handwritten notes scattered across the desk became tools, symbols of a plan I was refining with careful precision. By late morning, the first encounters began. Victoria positioned herself near the discussion about final wedding arrangements, subtly undermining my input with pointed questions about my decisions. Her tone was casual, yet loaded, each comment a quiet assertion of dominance. I felt the initial sting of frustration, but I kept my expression neutral, observing reactions from the guests and weighing Daniel's responses. Who would support me? Who might align with her? I mentally mapped alliances, the patterns of influence, and the subtle disparities between her statements and the reality of our plans. Every move she made became fodder for strategy. I knew that correcting her publicly would risk an unnecessary confrontation. Patience and subtle, measured responses would carry the day. I prepared myself to assert control without tipping my hand prematurely, calculating each interaction carefully. As the day progressed, Victoria orchestrated a minor disruption, misplacing a key item intended for the ceremony, miscommunicating with a vendor. The chaos was small, but intended to embarrass and unsettle me. I handled it with quiet efficiency, retrieving the missing item and clarifying instructions without drawing attention to her ploy. Internally, I cataloged her behavior, noting patterns of sabotage, imagining how these moves might play into a larger strategy for control. Small victories today, I realized, would become ammunition tomorrow. Each carefully managed moment strengthened my position, reinforcing that composure and intelligence could neutralize her attempts at manipulation. I balanced my immediate emotional reaction with a strategic patience, never allowing her to see the frustration she sought to provoke. Later, I retreated briefly to my room, reviewing notes and observations from the morning and early afternoon. I anchored myself, reaffirming the strength and self-worth that had carried me through past challenges. Mapping key moments for calculated responses during the wedding, I reflected on Daniel's trust and support, using it as an emotional foundation to steady my resolve. Symbolic cues, the seating chart, a folded napkin, the subtle placement of decorations, reminded me of control and opportunity. Every choice, every glance, and every word had to be intentional. The stakes were clear. The coming days would test my composure, intellect, and capacity to reclaim the narrative of the wedding from Victoria's subtle manipulations. As I moved toward the main hall in the late afternoon, I caught fragments of a hushed conversation that hinted at yet another public challenge planned by Victoria. My pulse quickened, but a calm determination settled over me. Anxiety lingered, yet it was tempered by clarity. I would act strategically, turning each challenge into a calculated opportunity to assert my influence and ensure that the story of my wedding and my dignity remained firmly in my hands. Tomorrow would be decisive, every moment a test, every word a move on the chessboard I had prepared in my mind. And I was ready to play. The afternoon sun slanted through the French windows, casting long shadows across the living room where Victoria had already begun her subtle provocations. I noted her poised stance, the faint tilt of her chin as she made a pointed comment about my role in organizing the wedding. The remark was public enough to catch the attention of a few family members, but veiled in casualness, the kind that left her technically untouchable. I met her gaze briefly, masking any reaction, while inwardly cataloging every inconsistency in her words. Daniel stood nearby, offering a quiet, reassuring presence, his glance telling me he recognized the slight. Around us, the extended family moved in polite circles, unaware of the silent tension threading through the room. I prioritized my engagements mentally, deciding which interactions demanded immediate attention and which were better left for a strategic moment later. Emotional control became my shield and weapon, a quiet advantage in a room thick with unspoken rivalry. I bided my time, waiting for the precise moment to assert clarity and truth. When a minor misinformation threatened to mislead a vendor regarding the schedule, I interjected smoothly, offering the correct details with calm authority. In doing so, I revealed a subtle fact Victoria had attempted to conceal, establishing my competence without drawing undue attention to her oversight. The room accepted the correction without fanfare, but I noticed appreciative glances from Daniel and a few close friends, admiration for the quiet efficiency I demonstrated. Every word, every correction, was calculated, an exercise in shaping the narrative without revealing the full extent of my awareness. I anticipated her next move even as I maintained outward composure, mentally rehearsing countermoves, holding control over the sequence of events like a carefully placed chess piece. Despite the calm exterior, internal tension simmered. I weighed the moral consequences of each potential confrontation, reflecting on the recurring patterns of favoritism and manipulation that had threaded through family events for years. The choice to act or hold back was not about submission, but about preserving strategic advantage while protecting my dignity and reputation. Each action carried potential ripple effects on Daniel, the family dynamic, and the broader wedding environment. I imagined dialogue, potential questions, and the outcomes they might provoke, balancing immediate emotional impulses with calculated restraint. It was a mental tightrope, a constant assessment of risk versus gain, all while maintaining the semblance of calm and composure expected in such formal surroundings. As the late afternoon unfolded, I retreated momentarily to gather my thoughts, reviewing observations and key documents. I reaffirmed personal boundaries, identifying non-negotiable standards for how I expected to be treated, and reinforced my confidence through reflection and internal dialogue. Visual cues, seating arrangements, and other symbolic elements became tools for subtle assertion of influence. I practiced language in my mind, assertive yet non-aggressive, preparing for moments when a measured response could turn a slight into leverage. Daniel's quiet support remained an anchor, reinforcing the certainty that our approach to any escalation would be coordinated, deliberate, and effective. Each plan, each consideration, was a step toward reclaiming control in a situation designed to test my patience and strategic intelligence. As early evening settled in, a fragment of conversation caught my attention, a whispered plan between Victoria and another family member hinting at a subtle, potentially humiliating scenario she intended to orchestrate during an upcoming event. My pulse quickened, but I did not move. Anxiety mixed with a sharpened focus, awareness of the stakes heightening my resolve. Timing would be everything. Execution had to be precise. This was the moment to translate observation into action, to ensure that any attempt at sabotage would be met with calculated retaliation, quietly but decisively asserting my authority. The game was no longer passive. It was active, measured, and deliberate. Every detail, every choice, would determine who truly controlled the narrative in the days to come. I was ready. The house felt unusually quiet that evening, almost deceptive in its calm. I sat in my room, reviewing the last few days in my mind, tracing Victoria's maneuvers from rehearsal dinner through the minor skirmishes earlier that day. Every subtle remark, every misdirection, suddenly took on a new significance. I recalled a passing comment she had made 2 afternoons ago about an overlooked vendor contract, something I hadn't fully registered at the time. That small detail now unfolded like a hidden key, revealing a potential leverage point I could wield strategically. I mapped the possibilities mentally, weighing which moves would yield the maximum effect with minimal exposure. My pulse slowed as I visualized potential confrontations, measuring risks and outcomes, balancing the inevitability of public scrutiny with my need to assert authority. The emotional stakes were high, yet I centered myself, reminding that poise and restraint could be as potent as any overt action. Each thought was deliberate, each scenario examined from every angle, a silent pivot forming in my mind. I began to assess potential allies with care, identifying those whose support or tacit acknowledgement could fortify my position. Daniel's quiet confidence was one thing, but I needed more. Trusted family members who could notice inconsistencies or staff who might provide subtle intelligence without tipping off Victoria. Observing their interactions and responses gave me a clear sense of who could be swayed or serve as unintentional informants. Then came a small but critical twist. A family friend handed me a folder of correspondence and notes Victoria had carelessly left behind. The insight was immediate, the leverage tangible. My plan crystallized in sequence and timing, each step calculated to maximize impact. Outwardly, I maintained a calm demeanor, a serene presence amid the bustling pre-wedding activity. Inside, I was poised to act decisively when the moment arrived. Yet, even with strategic advantage, internal conflict lingered. I wrestled with the desire for immediate vindication versus ethical restraint. Public confrontation could expose faults, but risked complicating the dynamics of the wedding, unsettling Daniel, or reflecting poorly on me. Private resolution preserved discretion, but might allow Victoria to continue unchecked. I analyzed potential outcomes, rehearsing phrases, gestures, and the weight of each word. Lessons from past experiences, moments when patience had yielded power, anchored my emotional response. My mind worked as both planner and guard, balancing the intensity of resentment with calculated restraint. preparing to convert frustration into disciplined action. As evening deepened, I began outlining tangible elements for the coming confrontation. Contracts, documented correspondences, and carefully gathered observations would all play a role, forming both symbolic and practical leverage. I imagined the public scenario, timing precise, responses measured, my credibility intact while subtly exposing her manipulations. Coordination with allies was essential. We would act in unison to ensure no misstep could diminish the impact. Mental scripts ran through my mind, anticipating possible distractions, provocations, or attempts at misdirection from Victoria. Every detail reinforced control, every preparation strengthened resolve. I visualized the sequence unfolding exactly as planned, the public outcome in my favor, a quiet but undeniable assertion of authority. Then, just as I was reviewing the final elements in my mind, a last-minute twist emerged. A message, apparently unintended, revealed a change in Victoria's plan, a move designed to undermine the careful control I had been building. My pulse quickened, yet I felt an acute clarity. Anxiety and tactical readiness coexisted, sharpening focus rather than diminishing it. The game had reached its apex. Timing and precision would dictate the outcome. Every gesture, every word, every calculated pivot mattered. This was the threshold where silent observation became decisive action, where anticipation and preparation would finally convert into strategic execution. I inhaled slowly, steadying my mind, knowing that a single misstep could unravel the careful control I had painstakingly constructed. Yet I was ready, every measure, every plan aligned, poised to turn the tables and reclaim the narrative that had been slipping from my grasp. The wedding hall buzzed with the polite hum of guests, yet beneath the surface, tension crackled like static. I took a deep breath, reviewing every detail I had meticulously documented, the vendor contracts, the subtle notes from allies, the patterns of Victoria's manipulations. Timing was critical, every ally positioned where they could quietly reinforce my strategy without revealing the full extent of our plan. Then came the first challenge, a subtle maneuver from Victoria, an offhand remark meant to undermine my credibility before the ceremony even began. I absorbed it without flinching, anchoring myself in past lessons on patience, resilience, and emotional control. Guests glanced our way, sensing something unspoken, while I remained calm, alert to each micro-expression, each flicker of movement, prepared to act decisively when the moment came. As the formal introductions began, I initiated the first stage of the confrontation. Every word, every gesture was measured, precise. I subtly referenced documents that highlighted inconsistencies in Victoria's claims, letting evidence speak without raising my voice. Guests began to notice, whispers curling like smoke around the room, the social pressure quietly mounting against her. Then a twist. An ally interjected, presenting corroborating evidence Victoria had overlooked, amplifying the impact of my carefully curated narrative. I maintained a composed exterior, letting the tension rise externally, while internally I calculated the next moves. My intelligence, foresight, and composure set a stark contrast to Victoria's faltering confidence, highlighting the strategic, silent hero in plain view. Victoria attempted to regain control, launching a public countermove with veiled threats and sharp remarks, attempting to discredit me in front of family and friends. A small legal technicality she thought hidden surfaced, but I had anticipated it, ready to counter without a single outburst. My pulse quickened, but I centered myself, balancing suspense with clarity. Every thought considered consequences, weighing the moral ramifications of responses against the need to protect my dignity, my relationship with Daniel, and the wedding's decorum. Her aggressive display only reinforced the stakes: personal reputation, family dynamics, and the subtle power plays that had guided our interactions for weeks. I acknowledged the anxiety, yet kept my focus razor-sharp, recalling that measured action could turn the tide. Finally, the moment arrived. I executed the climactic reveal, leveraging the evidence, the ally support, and the careful orchestration of timing. Victoria's scheme unraveled before the eyes of the family and guests, her social credibility visibly eroded. I delivered each point with verbal precision, supported by subtle gestures that reinforced authority and control without aggression. The audience witnessed my intellect, moral fortitude, and strategic foresight, every action fair but decisive. The social hierarchy subtly shifted. Victoria's influence, built on manipulation, collapsed under the weight of truth. In that moment, restrained patience transformed into empowered agency. I felt the culmination of weeks of careful observation, reflection, and planning coalesce into a tangible victory, the emotional impact resonating in the room without a single raised voice. As the hall settled, the aftermath of the confrontation lingered like a soft echo. I allowed myself a brief pause to process the residual tension, the satisfaction tempered by the recognition that not all consequences were resolved. Family dynamics would continue to ripple, subtle social repercussions lingering beyond immediate victory. Even so, I felt a quiet triumph, the strategic execution affirming my intelligence, patience, and moral compass. The path ahead would require careful navigation, yet the pivotal moment had passed, just as quietly and decisively asserted. With a final glance at the now calm room, I knew the next chapter would focus on restoration, reconciliation, and the measured closure that comes after a battle well fought. The evening air was calm after the whirlwind of the wedding day, a soft contrast to the storm that had unfolded hours earlier. I sat quietly, reflecting on the climactic confrontation and the way each piece had fallen into place. Victoria's schemes had been exposed, her manipulations rendered ineffective, and final consequences, legal, financial, and social, ensured that justice was respected. Relief coursed through me, tempered by the lingering sting of betrayal and the cautious optimism of what lay ahead. I acknowledged the support of allies whose subtle interventions had been pivotal, recalibrating my understanding of family dynamics and who could be trusted. Forgiveness lingered in my mind, yet accountability remained clear. Lessons in self-worth, boundaries, and the power of strategic patience would guide me moving forward. As conversations unfolded, I began the delicate work of rebuilding family and personal relationships. With careful diplomacy, I engaged relatives and friends, aiming to restore balance while respecting the integrity of past actions. Subtle empathy and measured words fostered understanding, and I noticed which individuals were open to healing and which preferred distance. Reflections on prior missteps informed how I approached each interaction, creating space for reconciliation without sacrificing my independence. Bonds with those who had remained loyal strengthened, reminding me that support often came from quiet, steadfast presence rather than grand gestures. In these moments, I saw the value of emotional intelligence and patience in realigning fractured connections. Personal victory was not merely social, it was internal. I reviewed my achievements, the resilience I had demonstrated, and the financial and emotional security I had preserved. Empowerment had arisen from deliberate, thoughtful action rather than impulsive revenge, and I allowed myself a quiet pride in that realization. Past twists and manipulations had become tools of insight, consolidating lessons that now guided decision-making in all areas of life. Symbolic acts, like reclaiming a misappropriated family heirloom and receiving acknowledgement for my contributions, reinforced the sense of personal authority I had earned. I understood that true growth stemmed from asserting one's boundaries and maintaining integrity while navigating complex interpersonal landscapes. Evening settled gently, bringing a sense of emotional closure. I considered the future with cautious optimism, aware that life would continue to present challenges and imperfections, both in others and myself. Internal reflection grounded me in resilience, emphasizing the confidence I had cultivated to face whatever lay ahead. Love, family, and moral integrity now served as guiding principles, anchoring me amid lingering complexities. I acknowledged that life's narrative would continue, but the lessons from this chapter, patience, strategic thinking, and self-respect, would remain my compass. The past had left its marks, but I had chosen the story I told about myself, one defined by strength, clarity, and measured grace. As I turned my gaze toward the silk scarf on the dresser, the same one that had subtly anchored my emotional journey since my first visit to Victoria's home, I felt the circle of experience close. That small, unassuming object symbolized vigilance, resilience, and growth. In its quiet presence, I recognized how far I had come, from navigating hidden manipulations to asserting justice and reclaiming narrative control. The future remained open, but I was ready to step forward with agency and clarity, leaving behind what no longer served me. The past may leave its marks, but I finally decide the story I tell about myself.